so much for coming. We're really excited. I love this conference, and I'm really excited to present this project. It's our first project that we've done together. We're going to be thinking about diagnosis. For the purposes of our project, we're focusing on medical diagnosis. If you're interested in how this might extend to other sorts of diagnoses, we can talk about that in the Q&A. But for the purposes of the presentation, constrain your thoughts to medical diagnosis. So let me start to set the stage by thinking about a case study. So Rebecca, my mother, was diagnosed with breast cancer in 2016. In a lot of ways, this diagnosis felt really impactful, right? It signaled the beginning of lots of doctor's appointments, traumatic treatments, a new relationship with her body. But in other ways, it seems like the diagnosis didn't do a lot. It didn't give my mother cancer. The cancer was already there. Presumably, if she had never been diagnosed, she still would have had cancer. So we wanted to think about what role diagnosis is playing in Rebecca's life, and more broadly, the importance or the relevance of diagnosis in general life. So we wanted to ask, what happens when one is diagnosed? Or what exactly does diagnosis do if we think about diagnosis as a sort of speech act? Here's one account that you might find intuitive, but ultimately we think is wrong. You might think that diagnosis serves a purely informative role. So there's some fact in the world, whether or not someone has a given condition set out by certain diagnostic criteria, and all diagnosis does is picks out that fact, says that that fact is true. So diagnosis, when done correctly, is when a person is given a diagnosis that properly characterizes some condition that they have, right? So we're going to call this the purely informative account of diagnosis. Well, not purely informative, but primarily informative. The main goal is to describe a true fact about the world. We want to give a different account on which diagnosis does a little bit more in some ways and less in others. So Ethan's going to describe our account.
So like we said, we're taking diagnosis to be something of a kind of speech act. So short version of the idea there, basically sometimes we just do things with our words that aren't conforming. We promise, we marry people, those sorts of things. We do things with our words. We're taking diagnosis to be very much in that sort of space. And so our account is one in which diagnosis doesn't just play the informative role, like we said. Rather, what it's doing is it's placing the diagnosed individual into a particular kind of social group. But it's just the social group of those who have been diagnosed with the disease. This is not going to just be, well, it sounds obvious. It's not just an empty concept, though, because being placed into social groups has pretty big effects sometimes. And the one we want to focus on is that it gives a prima facie justification for certain kinds of treatment, be that medical treatment or social treatment, and we'll talk about some examples of that later on. It's important to highlight now that what we're saying is it just gives prima facie justification for various kinds of treatments, because that sort of justification can be defeated by various other concerns. Cases like if you're allergic to certain recommended treatments, if you have various other related comorbidities that would conflict with the standard treatments. In some cases, if you don't consent, again, that would defeat the prima facie justification there. But yeah, so our account is one where it provides these sort of prima facie justification for certain kinds of treatments, and then diagnosis is warranted just in case those treatments that it justifies are in fact warranted.
Yeah, so just to briefly summarize what Ethan just said, on our account, diagnosis serves the role of placing the person diagnosed into a particular social group. Being part of that social group isn't trivial. It serves to justify particular treatments of the person who is diagnosed. So here's why you should prefer our account to the informative account. I think it better captures our practice and the role that we take diagnosis to play in our everyday life. So it explains why receiving a diagnosis, even when the diagnosis is expected, So you might know that you have a disorder or suspect to a high enough level, you have a high enough credence that you have a diagnosis, but you still might need to seek a professional diagnosis in order to access the benefits, the treatment, and the accommodations that you might require. This doesn't make sense on an informative account. If diagnosis just is providing information, presumably you already have the information. What you need is access to treatment. Second, it characterizes the way in which a diagnosis is not based solely on information about the person, but instead relies on a large basis of empirical data that we've collected based on other individuals who have also been diagnosed with this treatment or been diagnosed with this condition. So when we're determining what sorts of treatment might be justified or how we ought to treat you if you get a diagnosis, we don't just base it on some fact about you. We instead base it on what's been effective for other people. So it makes sense that we want to say that when you're diagnosed, you're lumped in with all these other people who have received similar diagnoses. Third, it maintains the importance of diagnosis in light of skepticism about the legitimacy of certain conditions. So you might compare this to skepticism about scientific realism due to theory change over time. We know that conditions change. We've been wrong about what constitutes a condition in the past, and we likely still are. We know that future editions of, for example, the DSM are going to come out, the Diagnostic Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, as well as the ICM, the International Code of, ICD, diseases. The diagnostic criteria for these conditions are going to change, but diagnosis for conditions that might change names or might look different in the future still deserve diagnoses today. It also aligns with the current common practice of receiving a diagnosis that's known to be inaccurate in order to receive treatment. You might think of the common practice in mental health care of giving a patient a diagnostic code in order to get their therapy covered by insurance, because insurance requires a diagnostic code in order to pay for treatment. You might also think that students in school settings might warrant a diagnosis of ADHD in order to get testing accommodations, if our primary goal is just to give them accommodations, not necessarily to determine whether or not they have ADHD. And lastly, it allows us to explain instances in which one ought not to receive a diagnosis, even when one meets the relevant diagnostic criteria. This is important, and it's one that we're going to focus on. On the purely informative account, if you meet the diagnostic criteria, it is proper to give you the diagnosis. We think this is mistaken. We think that there are instances in which someone meets the diagnostic criteria, and yet it might still be justified to not provide a diagnosis. In fact, sometimes we ought not to provide the diagnosis. So Ethan's going to explain the sorts of cases we have in mind.
To briefly backtrack for a second. Just to highlight on the second to last bullet point there, the cases we're interested in are ones where it is giving someone a diagnosis of something we believe that they don't have for other purposes, just to highlight that. So it's what would traditionally be on the informative count an incorrect diagnosis. We're saying that there's still quite a value to those in some cases. So what we're focused on now is reasons not to diagnose, which again, as you just said, doesn't make a lot of sense on the informative account. The informative account just says we're informing, and therefore it makes sense straightforwardly to diagnose anyone that fits the diagnostic criteria. Instead, there seem to be a lot of other cases. So some of the cases that we're interested in, one case where you might want to not diagnose someone is a case where diagnosing them would place undue burdens on them. So we're interested in perhaps a case of someone who wishes to avoid chemotherapy in spite of a cancer diagnosis, but they also don't want to have to explain again and again why they've chosen not to do chemotherapy. It can be a very personal decision, and the reasons for having to explain that aren't necessarily the kinds of things you want to explain to everyone that knows you've been diagnosed with cancer. It might be the case that the costs are in fact higher to have to keep explaining your own personal decision rather than the cost of not diagnosing them in such an instance. So that's one example of avoiding undue burdens. additionally, insofar as diagnosis gives you this sort of prima facie justification for various kinds of treatments, withholding the diagnosis also withholds that sort of justification for those treatments. And this can be valuable, particularly in cases where the standard treatments are particularly bad in various ways, or harmful. Harmful, yes, is better. So again, as we said earlier, we're interested in both medical and non-medical or social treatment in this sort of in these cases. So for medical examples, it's pretty easy to find cases if you go back historically of medical treatments that are quite harmful, even across the board. Surgery, yes, is cutting you open, but we don't think it's harmful, all things considered typically. Lobotomies, on the other hand, seem pretty harmful. So these were past treatments for all sorts of various medical disorders.
Particularly schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, and major depressive disorder for women.
Yes.
So.
It is a historical claim, but it does seem like there's far less cost of not diagnosing someone if you know that the treatment they're going to receive is a lobotomy. The cost of doing a lobotomy on someone, the cost to them, is very high, whereas the cost of not diagnosing them relatively low.
In that instance.
In that instance, yes, thank you. So additionally, this extends outside of just historical examples. So ABA therapy.
Applied behavioral therapy.
Thank you, yes. Currently it's what the APA, not for us, for psychology, recommends as the standard treatment for autism, and it's received some serious pushback on moral grounds. So if again you think this is one that's on the balance quite harmful, this gives a great explanation for why you might not want to diagnose someone on the grounds that the expected treatment is actually going to harm them far more than any lack of diagnosis would. Additionally, we have cases like conversion therapy, where it seems like that's something of a medical treatment. Whatever the relevant diagnosis there is, homosexuality has left the recent editions of the DSM that was in there.
Gender dysphoria is.
Yes, gender dysphoria maps onto a very similar set of distinctions here, although interacts interestingly with treatment options. But in any case, all of these various medical treatments, if they're the standard treatments, and it seems to be on balance harmful, it might just be more costly to have to avoid the prima facie justified treatment than it is to not diagnose in the first place. So all of these are medical examples, but there are also social examples as well. So what I mean is just examples of social treatment that seem harmful, that seem to follow from a diagnosis in various cases. So one of the primary ones that we wanted to focus on, and we do in the paper that it's based on, is the notion of conversational silencing. So this is an idea that's taken from various other accounts, so accounts from Langton or Matra or Kukla, all sort of reference an idea in this space. It's basically the idea that sometimes, typically given certain unjust circumstances, certain moves in a conversation are cut off from you. So you can't do certain things, you can't undertake certain speech acts.
The standard example is, so following Langton, her argument is that pornography silences women and that women are unable to do the speech act of refusing a sexual advance because anything she says is going to be taken as evidence that she actually does want the sexual advance or sexual experience to occur. So the idea is women are silenced because they have no effective way of saying no. So in our case, or what we're saying is sometimes a diagnosis might make it the case that certain conversational moves are blocked from persons who have received a diagnosis.
Right. And again, there are several accounts of what precisely silencing is in this sort of way. We're not trying to take a particular one on this one, but anything you want to fit into that space is going to fit into this sort of grounds. So some of the examples that we have in mind in this sort of case based on diagnosis specifically. So in light of a schizophrenia diagnosis, one may become unable to report on information and have that, that only they have gathered. So if I received a schizophrenia diagnosis and I try to tell my friends, oh, I just heard a noise, there's probably someone outside. There's serious blocks in the way of that being taken into account as evidence. Whereas if I had not received that diagnosis, it seems like those blocks have gone away, because post-diagnosis, there seems to be a plausible explanation of hallucination to explain the various sounds that I heard. assuming no one else heard them. Something in that sort of space. Or alternatively, when they lose the ability to either deny or withdraw consent for certain sorts of treatments after receiving
Medical treatment.
yeah, medical treatments as well, after receiving certain sorts of diagnoses, so particular bipolar disorder or major depressive disorder.
Yeah, you might be unable to say that you do not want either life-saving treatment or medication like antipsychotics, which could bring you down from a psychotic episode. The idea would be that you have no way to effectively communicate, one, I'm of sound mind and do not want this treatment, and two, I'm not currently experiencing a psychotic episode. At some point, anything you say will just be taken as evidence that you actually are unable to make these decisions for yourself because you're incapacitated in some way and therefore unable to deny or withdraw consent for treatment.
So obviously it's not that you can't say the words, I do not want this treatment, but saying the words, I do not want this treatment, doesn't undertake
It
the
fails
act.
to get uptake on behalf of the hearer.
Yes,
Yeah.
and so then the speech act, traditionally understood, would fail, is the idea there. Okay. Additionally, another few examples are certain kinds of diagnoses can lead to experiences of discrimination and social stigma, particularly common around mental health diagnoses. There's a lot of social stigma around various mental health diagnoses, but this extends to other sorts of diagnoses as well. So some of the examples I have in mind are like in the past, HIV and AIDS diagnoses were met with serious social stigma. So the case I have in mind is consider how big of a deal it was when Princess Diana shook the hands of an AIDS patient, where it was just seen as like, oh, don't touch them, it's contagious. Like, that's something to stay away from. That seemed to go a long way to breaking down this sort of social stigma, which is evidence that there was this sort of a social stigma in the first place, and you become a target of this stigma by receiving this diagnosis and being able to receive this diagnosis.
Yeah, do you mind if I
Go
throw
ahead.
something really quickly? We don't necessarily, for the purposes of this presentation, have to take a stand on whether or not any of these examples are instances where the treatments are bad enough such that you shouldn't diagnose these conditions, something like that. Only that the fact that they justify, or at least prima facie justify these treatments, is relevant to whether or not they should receive the diagnosis. The purely informational account is unable to capture how the fact that being diagnosed justifies treatment is relevant to whether or not you should diagnose. On the informative account, all you're doing is describing a fact about the world. That seems to be the case regardless of what receiving a diagnosis would do to you. Our account better captures the ways in which we need to take into consideration what happens after you're diagnosed to decide whether or not to diagnose.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. Okay, good for...
Okay, yeah, so, okay, yeah. Sorry, I didn't mean to take your...
No, you're
Go
good.
for it.
Yeah, so just to sum up and recap what we've said here. So what we've argued is that a diagnosis does not merely convey information about a person, instead places them into a particular kind of social group. Again, it's the group of those diagnosed, blah, blah, blah. Diagnosis can be beneficial for a number of reasons, as we've noted, that can provide much needed access to treatments, etc. It can also be quite harmful in other cases for the same kinds of reasons, given that it gives this prima facie justification for treatment. Thus, anyone with the power to diagnose needs to consider more than just the accuracy of the diagnosis, as you noted, but also the treatment that a diagnosis is likely to justify and whether that treatment is itself warranted in a particular case.
So we'll save 10 minutes for Q&A.
Thank you very much.